On South Asia. Welcome to the podcast produced by the Department of Modern South Asian Languages and Literatures, South Asia Institute, Heidelberg.
Welcome to On South Asia, a podcast by the Department of Modern South Asian Languages and Literatures, Heidelberg. My name is Chaiti Basu, and today our guest is Professor Nasir Uddin, cultural anthropologist and senior faculty member in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Chittagong, Bangladesh. Professor Nasir Uddin has held positions as a visiting professor and as a visiting scholar at various universities all around the world, like Harvard, Oxford, Johns Hopkins, SOAS, and many more. Professor Nasir Uddin is currently a visiting professor in Heidelberg, funded by the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation for the winter term 2025-26. He is currently offering a graduate seminar and a research workshop on the issues of displacement and refugee crisis in South Asia at the South Asia Institute. Many of his books and articles are widely discussed and cited in the scholarship on refugees, stateless people, asylum seekers, forced migration, camp people, displaced people, illegal migrants, borderland people, and non-citizens. We are really delighted to have you here today, Professor Nasir Uddin. Let me begin by asking the obvious. How did you become interested in such an unconventional career of cultural anthropology?
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation. Actually, in Bangladesh, Bangladesh is popularly represented as a country of, kind of marginalized people, the vulnerable to climate change, and also a lot of indigenous people living there. And also Bangladesh is known for Rohingya refugees. So at the beginning of my academic career, I had a kind of intellectual fascination to work for the marginalized people, for the people belonging to the economically, politically lower class of the people, so for academically terms. So there's a couple of motivations behind my intellectual academic career to work for the marginalized people.
How and why did you decide to focus on the issue of the displaced, which was and still is a big and controversial issue not only in South Asia, but also all over the world in current times? Also, in this respect, with Bangladesh as our focus, I'd like to ask you, who are the Rohingyas? And what about the Rohingya issue, which plays a pivotal role in current world scenario?
The identity and ethnicity of Rohingya is not so easy to define and explain in a couple of sentences, because the Rohingya is an independent ethnic community, is an independent nation, but Rohingya has been formed as a category of nation historically over the last 2,000 years. So it's a combination of multiple trends of multiple nations and travelers from around the world. But Rohingya, they themselves is called Rohingya. Rohingya is an independent nation, and they are within the Myanmar state. They claim themselves as the it's called son of the soil. It's called people of the soil. But the Rohingya issue, and why Rohingya is a problematic too, because Rohingya people became stateless in 1982 when Myanmar enacted citizenship law conferring citizenship to 35 nationals excluding Rohingya. Though Rohingya have been living there for more than 1,000 years, but they became stateless in 1982, and since then actually they experienced a couple of state different kind of policies of exclusion, deprivations, and atrocities. But it was started from 1962 when military took over state power. Since then, this is the beginning of atrocities against Rohingya people. But it actually got momentum in 2017, and there was a massive genocidal campaign against Rohingya people that actually displaced more than 700,000 people who crossed the border and took shelter in Bangladesh. Previously, a lot of Rohingya people were living there. Now, Bangladesh hosts more than 1.5 million people. In Balukhali is considered as the world's largest refugee camp. So that's the reason why international attention is there. And Rohingya crisis, became one of the sensational crises of refugee people around the world.
Thank you for elaborating on that. Could you tell us about the theoretical lens of subhuman, which you have used in regard to the Rohingyas in two of your monographs? The Rohingyas, a case of subhuman life in 2020, and again in the Voices of the Rohingya People, a case of genocide, ethnocide, and subhuman life in 2022.
Yeah, actually, when I was trying to understand the vulnerable situation, extreme form of vulnerability of Rohingya people, and I was exploring the available scholarship, available theories on refugee, migrations, stateless people, non-citizen, forcibly displaced people, illegal migrants, and stateless people. But I found that existing theories, particularly to understand the refugee and this domain of people, almost all theories, I don't want to name, the scholars. So almost all theories considered vulnerable people, particularly this domain of people, are kind of a legal category, disregarding their human subjectivity. So that's what actually, struck me. Then I found that there are a lot of people belonging, around the world who are living in very vulnerable situations, but they belong to a particular state. They have citizenship. So it's not a question of, statelessness. It's not a question of non-citizenship. Rather, this is a question of state's nature. Gradually, the state's growing intolerance nature towards the people of cultural difference, towards the people of racial difference, towards the people of different faiths. That's actually, created this kind of situations. And I found that, nobody becomes refugee by choice. Refugees are made, refugees are produced, amid different kind of geopolitical interest of global, powerhouse. So that's what actually struck me, and I found this subhuman life. Subhuman life is just essentially a subcategory of human being. Rather, this is a category of people who lead their life lesser than human being. As a human being, that a human being deserves of different forms of treatment, with dignity, civil rights, political rights, different kind of, human rights. But these people are actually, treated. They are born in the world, but the world doesn't own them. And they are treated as if they are lesser than human being. So actually the subhuman, the whole idea, I found it on the ground. And you might know I've been doing research on the Rohingya people more than 2.5 decades. So the long term. So many occasions I talk to the people, interview the people, and they sometimes say that even animals received a kind of, treatment that we do not. So that's they feel that their life as if they are lesser than, they are not human beings. They're lesser than human beings. And another point I need to just note here, UN declarations in Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, it confirms that every individual has every right to citizenship. So why more than 10 million people are stateless then? They didn't fall down from the sky. They didn't go off the land, But this is so there should be, some flaws in our state system, in our legal frameworks, locally, regionally, globally. So consider everything. I found that actually people are not only just a legal object. We need to pay respect to human subjectivity. That's the fundamentals of subhuman lives.
Oh, correct. Thank you. In the study of anthropology of the state and the margins, your argumentation that the state has many faces has also been cited widely. Could you please tell us a bit more about this topic?
Yeah, ethnography of state is pretty interesting one. In 1940, anthropologists, particularly Evans Pritchard and Mayer Force, they edited a book. It's called African Political Systems. And in this book, at that time, the renowned anthropologists wrote the kind of wonderful preface that's okay. We should, keep the state for sociologists. Rather, anthropologists should pay attention to stateless people. So at that time, actually, anthropologists avoided macro topic. Anthropology rather paid attention to micro topic, micro society, stateless societies. But the beginning of 21st century or the later quarter of 20th century, anthropologists started understanding state from a different framework. Anthropology is not a kind of centralized bureaucratic system. Anthropologists started talking about state is not a centralized bureaucratic system. This state actually lives in everyday life. We need to understand state from ordinary people's everyday forms of lives. State actually appears with different faces in different contexts in our everyday life. That's ethnography of state. So what we wrote, our theoretical contribution, we wrote the many faces of a state in the context of Chittagong Hill Tracts. In the Chittagong Hill Tracts, the indigenous people, me and my colleague Eva Gerach, a German sociologist, we actually focused on how the indigenous people in Chittagong Hill Tracts, they face state after 1997. When 1997 was peace treaty, treaty was signed between state and the representative of indigenous people. But we tried to understand how people understand this peace and conflict in their everyday life. And we found that they actually experience state in their everyday life in the form of military presence, in the form of civil bureaucracy, in the form of even, choose and pick indigenous leaders by the state. So state actually appears in different forms. And this is, this contemporary anthropology, ethnography of state, understanding state is a wonderful, very fascinating, domain of scholarship.
Wonderful. Contrary to the conventional notion of border as a spatial and territorial boundary that usually separates and segregates with strict authoritarian power, you see border as a humanized space. How do you come to this conclusion?
That's also interesting topic actually I focused on and I've been working on. Border is always represented as a kind of regimented, very strict, military forcing, fencing. Border is something always a kind of policing idea. But I found that because, I've been working on the borderland people, particularly Myanmar and Bangladesh border, Chittagong Hill Tracts, and also the Rohingya people. They are borderland people actually. And also, I have the experience of working on enclaves, you might know, that the Indian-Bangladesh borders. So I found that conventionally the border is always represented in a way that border is very regimented, a lot of border patrolling, policing. But I found that globally border appears to the vulnerable people to save their life, because a lot of hundreds of thousands of people cross the border as refugees and save their lives. Like, for example, I wrote about this border as a humanized space in the context of Rohingya refugees. When 2017 Myanmar military forces they launched kind of is called Operation Clearance. It's a kind of genocidal campaign at the time. The Rohingya people, they're living in Rakhine state, they actually crossed the border, they saved their lives. So border does not essentially a kind of, regimented, space. And I always try to, frame that border does not essentially separate to state, rather it connects. So border is also connects to states. Sometimes border actually saves people's life. Border appears as a kind of savior of lives. That's why border could be, kind of, you can see, for example, when Tamil, crisis at the time, Tamil actually crossed the border and they went to Tamil Nadu, for example. Okay, Afghan refugee crisis started. Afghans crossed the border. Afghans people in 2021, when actually U.S. military troops left Afghanistan, at that time Kabul, and people crossed the border to Pakistan, and Afghan people they crossed the border to Iran. This is nearest border, right? When Syrian crisis, they just crossed the border. Venezuelan refugee crisis, they just crossed the border everywhere. So border does not essentially always a kind of security entity. Rather than it could be actually a humanized space for many.
Yeah, thank you. We also talked about this enclaves between India and Bangladesh. Did you talk about this Teen Bigha, the corridors, but they are very fluid. There is another exception, I think, contrary to the notion of this territorialized borders where people can really move in and out freely, but of course with the concept of the state, right? Okay, let us come to another of your articulations. Ethnography is a joint product, and this has received praise and attention in the academic world. Could you please elaborate a little on that?
This is also interesting topic and interesting. Actually, I'm an anthropologist, and I have been, the very orthodox anthropologist. I always try to, talk to the people on the ground and try to live with them for longer time. Try to take part in their everyday life. Try to learn their language and try to understand from their point of view this. But that the whole anthropological scholarship is about, previously it was quote unquote ancient people, primitive people is quote unquote, and Adam Cooper wrote about the production of, invention of primitive societies. So primitive societies, the invention of actually anthropologists to some extent. But what I want to say broadly, who am I? For example, I published a monograph on the Kumi people. Who am I to talk about the Kumi, right? So Kumi, object of study, they are very much present in the ethnography. They actually, they played out in the ethnography. What we do, we just collect their narratives, their stories. We try to talk in our ethnography. So that's why I said ethnography is not the product. An ethnographer alone actually has done it. It's a joint product because the object, the people we study, they also talk, they also present, they also actually narrate their own story in the text. That's why ethnography, I say that I have ethnography. I have written ethnography, like I have written one book on Rohingya people, on Kumi people, and some can claim that I have written about, but the people are talking in the text. So texts are actually heavily loaded by the people themselves. That's why I propose the idea, this ethnography, 21st century ethnography, is also kind of encounter of political representation. So 21st century ethnography is a kind of joint product. This is the product by the ethnographer and the people studied together. Both are, both should be equally credited. That's the joint product.
Oh, like a dialogue between two parties. It is going on, yeah?
It's not one-way product.
Of course not, yeah. Let us now come to the last question of today's episode. We know that you have an extensive range of experience of working in many prestigious universities all around the world. So as the last question, I'd like to ask you how these experiences of traveling and working wildly across the world have impacted your research in any recognizable way.
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, I have the experience of doing research in many top-ranking universities in the world. Like, for example, when I went to UK, I worked with the University of Oxford, LSE, SOAS. When I went to Australia, I worked at the University of Sydney as a visiting professor. When I have come in Germany, I worked with, the Heidelberg University. When I went to, USA, I worked with Harvard University, Johns Hopkins University. So when I go to Japan, I work with Kyoto University. So the top ranking universities in the world, it actually helps me to understand how the global scholarships, global academia actually operates, functions, and the level of the standard of their scholarship, the worst. And also it also gives me kind of very comprehensive and inside idea about global South and global North, and also the politics of knowledge.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Taking a note from there, we have now come to the conclusion of today's episode. Thank you again, Professor Nasir Uddin, for your precious time and for sharing your knowledge and experience with us. And thanks to our audience for their time as well. We'll be back soon with another new episode of our podcast on South Asia. Until then.
Thank you so much.
You've listened to an episode of On South Asia, a podcast by the Department of Modern South Asian Languages and Literatures, South Asia Institute, Heidelberg. Have a look at our other episodes as well. For topic wishes and feedback, don't hesitate to reach out. You can find our email in the description.